You know, it's been almost a year since this whole HBO Max purge thing happened, and I feel like we're still feeling the aftershocks of that. It is very difficult to try and ignore the feeling that events like these may have been partially inspired. I think Zaslav might have actually started a revolution with this one.
I had to find something that really interested me, something that I really loved.
And that's not even getting into all the stuff that we've lost since then. There's at least a couple things that have stayed in my watch list pre-purge that I always mean to get back to. Never mind the stuff that I'm actually trying to cover. It just makes it so much more difficult. But it also does give us a chance to examine the more obscure parts of the pile. The series that probably weren't going to get much attention either way, but as a consequence of them just being Thanos snapped out of existence in the States, do have a slightly higher platform on which to be observed. I figured I'd take a break from our regularly scheduled programming to talk about one of them, because I did feel like I gleaned something from osmosis, just by watching it. It's amazing, isn't it? Dodo is a 2021 slice-of-life serial created by Jack Bennett with Wild Seed Productions. The series follows intrepid 11-year-old Joe Connolly as he navigates the ups and downs of big school for the very first time. Slated for a prospective Cartoon Network release date, it touched down on American HBO Max in April of 2022, less than 4 months before getting swept up in the Great Purge. If you knew where to look, you could find the series archived from far earlier, back when it was still airing on Australian public television. I only got to watch it about a year after it was available in the States. There's a deep futility to knowing you can't recommend certain shows anymore with the assumption that they can actually be viewed. Notable setback, but after giving it a couple rewatches, I was able to get a fair amount out of it that most wouldn't be able to. Generally speaking, I could see the art style being an impediment. What you see is what you get. Your rigged character models are pretty simplistic, and being mainly set at school or at Joe's house, the background work doesn't give you a whole lot to work with either. It doesn't look bad, it looks smooth. Totally fine. It's pretty bare bones visually speaking, but it does make up for it with character interaction and such. This series at large is decidedly a love story. There's this main arc involving Joe's love interest that isn't introduced until episode 4, but it really kicks off in episode 5, and it's the main anchor that's tethering all of these little vignettes in his life together. Lily Scott is not actually that far removed from Joe himself. Quiet, out of the way, bumbling to a fault. I have a hard time saying that she was humanized especially, but she's definitely not redundant either. I think that the show's main strength is that it has a particularly strong creative voice. And I'm not just talking about the narrator, because he is kind of holding it down for everyone.
Why aren't you talking?
Joe Connolly needs to say something.
Why don't you talk? Is that because you've got arthritis?
Like, there are quite a few cliches thrown into the mix. I mean, this is kind of a long-form rom-com, sold as a kid-com, but it does kind of know its own identity quite well. It is awkward, to a calculated degree. It is intentional, but it doesn't feel manufactured in any sense. It is scary, the amount of accuracy poured into some of these interactions. It's like you're cringing preemptively sometimes. I do get the sense that for some people it might be a little top-heavy. Maybe there's a few too many thoughts swirling around. But I don't get the sense that any of the secondary action is really filling things in for Joe, or trying to compensate for a lame protagonist. I think as far as aesthetics go, the mood is giving like Kids of Degrassi Street, or that one prequel to Saved by the Bell that I'm kind of blanking on. But when I think about the structure of this series, it's actually kind of pulling a Milo Murphy's Law. They take a hybridized approach to storytelling, because you have this arc that follows all the way through, over 20 episodes, within episodic batches. I will note as well that these are 11-minute episodes, so realistically speaking, if you were to package them for syndication, you're coming away with 10 half hours here. But even with just that, they had a lot of room to develop a proper pace and a rhythm, and a real voice for this set of characters. Overall, I think Dodo is pretty unassuming, but it has a decent amount to bring to the table. It's clear that it's a show that's passionate about the story it wants to tell, even if it's not a high fantasy epic. There was all manner of genre of cartoons that they got rid of in August, so I wouldn't say that its exclusion was especially discriminatory, though even if it did get its coveted slot on Cartoon Network, I'm unsure if they would have been able to do anything to push it forward. This series is decidedly set in modern day, but I'm constantly thinking of the time it seamlessly blends into. With a live-action coat of paint and a larger episode count, it could easily fit into the mid-2000s slate of British kidcoms. Episodic and self-contained, but largely narrative-driven properties. It's a reflection of a day and age when shit was allowed to breathe and there was more idle value in a quiet moment. A time far removed from our current one. As of the time of writing, we're about 10 months out from the purges, the strongest display of new management's cutthroat business strategy. Most recently, news of shakeups at TMC have been making the rounds. A 75% reduction in staff prompted the intervention of some of film's most powerful voices. This statement released in the aftermath reeks of copium to me, so jury's still out as to whether or not this will actually mean something. It's just another extension of the increasingly bleak position we've been put in as consumers. It's not as strongly related back to animation, but it's equally devastating. The creator of Dodo talked extensively about the short the series originates from called Not the End of the World, which is a condensed version of episodes 4 and 5, and squarely decided that this was a love story from the jump. It took tons of revisions to finalize, and was in some way the baby of several other voices. Aesthetically, it's almost unconcerned with itself, and that's an attribute that carries over into the show. It's poignant to a fault that a series born from a pilot that revels in being that more methodical alternative gets swallowed up in the maw of a major entertainment conglomerate and spit out barely any better off for it. You know, there was real time for it to breathe and for it to incubate. He spoke about there being 3 or 4 plots being juggled at once before paring it down to the one love story. There was obviously a lot of time poured into what many would consider to be a pretty simple story. But that time that it was allowed to have to refine itself to become better clearly resulted in a decent piece of art. Aside from the whole being written off and effectively sectioned off from being viewed throughout an entire continent thing, I think Dodo's been done a little dirty. I can't say what its viewing figures would have looked like in a timeline where AT&T never bought Warner Media out, but I can say that none of this shit helped. It was promised a slot on Cartoon Network, but even if it received one, it's difficult to say it would have reached its destination. Given its demographic, I get the sense that this was picked up as part of Cartoon Network's slated family-centric rebrand, as it does skew a bit older. Even in a space as non-competitive and comparatively disarming as Cartoonito, it's difficult to imagine a real future for what comes to it or out of it. It's far from an issue unique to this situation. The rise of streaming came with a whole host of problems. The adaptation of binge formats, the loss of event viewing, the expectation of instant reach and accessibility, the ease of commodification by greedy-ass companies, the list goes on. The scariest part about a lot of this is the uncertainty involved. There's always been a limited move set that consumers can pull out of the back pocket. If I had to try and end on a positive, it is transparent that animation will continue to exist as an art form. Even if the business goes down with a ship, there is always space to rebuild. At some point. Good stories will continue to be told no matter what platform they take on, and even if the main avenues for achieving such are knocked out of the running, it's up to us to uplift what we think is going to be responsible for a better and brighter future. There's always been a limited amount of time to come and know these things. It's only more common now that you get into a show and just as soon as you got into it, it's pretty much done. If the purges mean that everyone gets to be a bit more decisive about their media choices, then cool. I mean, it doesn't take away from the harm caused, but I mean, that's kind of neat, right? Things just aren't really given the chance to breathe anymore, but there is plenty of time in the aftermath to go back and reappraise certain things. And if we haven't learned anything else from the purges, I would hope that the ultimate takeaway is that there is always time to give something else a second chance. It's one of the easiest things you could do.